Okay, you guys, we're going to take a look at a few more exercises here in Chapter 6 to see how these present value calculations can be used in accounting situations. One way is when a corporation issues bonds. Now, corporate bonds are just another way a corporation has of financing operations. We'll get into them in a lot more detail in some later chapters. But when a corporation, maybe they need to borrow a large amount of money, well, a bank might not want that type of exposure. Let's say Walmart wants to borrow $1 billion. Well, a bank might not want that type of exposure, so Walmart could sell corporate bonds to the investing public. They're usually broken down in thousands. And when they issue those bonds or sell those bonds, they take on two distinct obligations. One, to pay the face amount at the end of the bond term. So let's say Walmart's wanting to borrow $1 billion from the investing public over 20 years. They'd get something in the neighborhood of $1 billion today, and at the end of 20 years, they'd have to repay the $1 billion. How much they receive today depends on what the rate of interest being paid by the bonds and compared to the market rate of interest for similar investments, and some present value calculations we're about to go through. But one obligation they take on is to repay the face amount at the end of the bond term and to pay interest periodically over the bond term, usually semi-annually or every 6 months. So let's read through the exercise 6-17 on page 352. It tells us on September 30th, 2016, San Filippo Corporation issued 8% stated rate bonds. Okay, that's the rate of interest they're going to pay annually to the bondholders, with a face amount of $300 million. Okay, that's how much they'll receive up front, somewhere in the neighborhood of $300 million, and then that's how much they'll have to repay at the end of the bond term. Every year they'll have to pay 8% interest, but if that's broken down semi-annually, it would be 4% every 6 months. Okay, the bonds mature on September 30th, 2036, so they're 20-year bonds. The market rate of interest for similar bonds was 10%. What they're saying is corporations with a similar credit rating, they're issuing bonds and paying a rate of 10%. This corporation is only paying a rate of 8%, so the investing public probably not going to be willing to pay the full $300 million for these bonds because they're not paying the full market rate of interest. Interest is payable semi-annually on March 31st and September 30th. They want us to determine the price of the bonds on September 30th, 2016. What they're really asking is for the cash proceeds. How much cash is San Filippo Corporation going to receive on September 30th, 2016 from the investing public when they issue these bonds? Well, I've got some notes for you here. Steps to calculate cash proceeds from a bond issue. Number one, we need to determine the present value of the face amount. Okay, I cut this down a little bit. It had a few references to a previous textbook, but with step one, we're going to determine the present value of the face amount. Okay, the face amount is a single sum that has to be repaid by the issuing corporation at the end of the bond term. Okay, so step one here, we're going to take the face amount, which is $300 million. We'll find our factor from the table present value of $1, because the $300 million is a single sum to be repaid in 20 years. Now, let's go a little further here. We have 20 years, but we're paying interest every 6 months, so 40 periods, 40 interest payment periods at half the market or effective rate. Here they call it the market rate. you'll always make your present value calculations using the market rate. Well, it's 10% for the year, which means it must be 5% every 6 months. All right, so we'll go to a factor from the present value of $1 table. Again, that's on page, you probably hear me flipping, P-2 in the back of your book. Okay, we're going to come to 5% and come down to the very bottom of the column. 40 periods, 0.14205. All right, then we're going to multiply those two together. So it's going to be equal to 300 million times our factor. And we get, what, 42,615,000. That's what 300 million, assuming interest is paid every 6 months at 5%. 300 million to be received 20 years from now is only actually worth 42,615,000 in today's dollars. That's assuming interest is paid 5% every 6 months over that 20-year period. We get 40 periods because we're paying interest twice a year for 20 years. We cut that market rate in half because if it's 10% for a year, it's 5% every 6 months. Okay, so that's our first step in calculating the cash proceeds. Let's go back. Step 2, we want to determine the amount of the individual semi-annual interest payments. How much interest is San Filippo going to have to pay every 6 months? Well, we'll take the face amount, 300 million, and then we're going to multiply by half the stated rate. The stated rate was 8%. That's 8% for a year. So for every 6 months, it would be 4%. So we're going to say 300 million times 4%, and we get $12 million is how much interest they'll owe every 6 months on this bond issue. Sorry. Okay, now we want to know what $12 million every 6 months for 20 years, how much is that worth today? So we want to take the present value of it. Well, it's going to be paid at the end of every 6 months, so we'll go find a factor from our table, present value of an ordinary annuity. We don't need factor from, let's just say, no, that's all right, I guess. Can we fit in our, it's again 40 periods. Twice a year for 20 years at half the market or effective rate. It's just two different names for the same thing. Here they call it the market rate. But this 12 million every 6 months for 20 years, that's equal cash payments over time. So it qualifies as an annuity. And since it's paid at the end of every 6 months, it's an ordinary annuity. So our semi-annual interest, $12 million every 6 months. For 20 years. So we'll flip to our table, present value of an ordinary annuity. That one is on page P-4. We'll come to 5% and down to 40 periods, 17.15909. Now we'll multiply those two together. And we get $205,909,080. Now, now we have the present value of the face amount, $300 million to be received in 20 years, assuming interest is payable every 6 months over that 20-year period at a rate of 5% every 6 months. That $300 million in today's dollars is only worth $42,615,000. The $12 million every 6 months for 20 years is worth $205,909,080 today. So if we want to know how much cash the bond purchasers would be willing to pay the issuing corporation, in this case San Filippo, we need to add together our two present values, and that's your fourth step. Determine the cash proceeds from the bond issue by adding together the present value of the face amount and the present value of the semi-annual interest payments. So we're just going to add together these two numbers. We've got $42,615,000 and $205,909,080 and $80. So don't forget the 80 bucks. Let's sum those two, and we've got our answer here. The cash proceeds from the bond issue, $248,524,080. That's how much cash San Filippo Corporation would receive on the day the bonds are issued, September 30th, 2016. They'd receive that much up front, then they'd pay $12 million in interest every 6 months. Then at the end of the bond term, at the end of that 20 years, they'd repay the $300 million. We'll get into that quite a bit more with the journal entries and all that in a later chapter, actually in the spring semester. But that's one way these present values are used for accounting purposes. I think after working this one with me, you won't have any trouble with the exercise 6-17 on the Connect site. I hope not. If you do, please be in touch with me. Thanks a lot.